There's a moment that doesn't arrive with noise, doesn't come with confrontation, and doesn't announce itself to the world, but it changes everything inside an empath. It's the moment when giving no longer feels like love. It starts to feel like loss. You see, for a long time, giving is how you connect. It's how you make sense of relationships. You listen deeply, you anticipate needs, you show up even when you're tired, even when no one asks you how you're doing. And at first, it feels meaningful. It gives you a sense of purpose, even identity. You become the safe place, the reliable one, the person everyone turns to. But slowly something begins to wear down, not all at once. It's subtle. It's the exhaustion you can't quite explain. It's the heaviness you carry after conversations that were never about you. It's the quiet disappointment when your care isn't returned, when your presence is expected but not appreciated. And still, you keep giving, because that's what you've always done, until one day your body starts to speak louder than your mind. You feel drained even before the interaction begins. You notice how certain people only show up when they need something. You begin to sense that what you once called connection is actually obligation. And that realization can be deeply unsettling, because it forces you to question something you've built your identity around. Was it ever mutual? Or were you simply overextending yourself, hoping that one day it would be? And this is where the shift begins, not in anger, not in resentment, but in awareness. You start to recognize that giving, when it comes from a place of depletion, is no longer generosity. It becomes self-abandonment. You begin to see that constantly prioritizing others at the expense of yourself isn't kindness. It's a quiet erasure of your own needs. And that truth can be difficult to sit with, because it asks you to do something unfamiliar. It asks you to pause, to step back, to no longer rush in to fix, to heal, to carry what was never yours to carry in the first place. And in that pause, there's discomfort, there's guilt, there's even fear of being misunderstood, of being seen as distant, or worse, as uncaring. But something deeper is happening beneath that fear. For the first time, you're listening to yourself. You're noticing your limits, your energy, your emotional capacity. You're beginning to understand that your worth was never meant to be measured by how much you can give, or how much you can endure. And as that understanding grows, the old patterns begin to feel unbearable. Not because you've become less compassionate, but because you've become more honest. Honest about what it costs you to keep showing up in the same way. Honest about the imbalance. Honest about the quiet toll it's taken on your sense of self. And so the giving changes. It becomes more intentional, more measured. You no longer pour from an empty place. You begin to ask yourself, do I have the capacity for this? And if the answer is no, you start to honor that, maybe for the first time in your life, and from the outside, it may look like withdrawal. It may look like distance. But what's really happening is something far more profound. You are reclaiming your energy. You are choosing not to disappear inside other people's needs. You are learning that your presence is valuable, but so is your absence. And in that quiet shift, without any need for explanation or validation, you begin to step away from what drains you, not out of rejection, but out of respect for yourself, because at some point you realize this simple, undeniable truth. If giving is costing you your peace, it is no longer love. It is loss. There's a particular kind of clarity that arrives quietly, almost gently, but once it settles in, it changes how you see everything. For an empath, this clarity often comes after a long period of confusion, of trying to make sense of relationships that never quite felt balanced, but were held on to anyway, because you tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. You look deeper, you justify, you empathize with their struggles, their wounds, their behavior. You tell yourself they didn't mean it, or they're going through something, or if I just show up a little more, maybe it will shift. And so you stay, you invest. You keep the connection alive even when it quietly drains you. But awareness has a way of catching up. It doesn't come from one dramatic moment. It builds slowly. It's in the patterns you can no longer ignore. It's in the repeated disappointments that begin to feel familiar rather than surprising. It's in the realization that your effort is consistent, but theirs is conditional. And then something inside you begins to ask a different kind of question. Not, how can I make this work? But, why am I the only one trying to make this work? That question can be uncomfortable, even painful, because it shifts the focus. It takes you out of their story and brings you back into your own. And from that place, you begin to see things more clearly, not through the lens of hope, but through the lens of truth. You start to notice who only reaches out when they need something, who listens just enough to respond, but not enough to understand, who benefits from your presence, but never truly supports yours. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to notice how often you've minimized your own needs just to keep the peace. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the turning point, because awareness doesn't always feel empowering at first. It can feel disorienting. It can make you question your past choices, your tolerance, even your own instincts. You might wonder why you stayed as long as you did, why you gave so much without receiving the same in return. But this isn't about blame. It's about understanding. Understanding that your empathy made you stay. That your capacity to see the good in people made you overlook what wasn't working. That your desire for connection made you accept less than what you truly needed. And now, something within you is asking for more. Not more from others, but more for yourself. More honesty, more reciprocity, more respect for your own emotional experience. And that's where the real shift happens. You begin to step out of denial and into alignment. You stop over-explaining, overextending, overcompensating. You no longer feel the need to prove your worth through effort. Instead, you start to observe, to listen, to recognize when something feels off, and to trust that feeling. This doesn't mean you become cold or detached. It means you become discerning. You understand that not every connection is meant to be maintained, that some relationships are built on imbalance, and no amount of giving will correct that. You begin to accept that it's not your role to fix, to rescue, or to carry what others are unwilling to take responsibility for, and perhaps the most difficult part. You allow yourself to feel the truth of it without rushing to soften it, because clarity, while freeing, can also be painful. It can bring grief, disappointment, even a sense of loss for what you thought something could be. But within that grief, there is also strength, the strength of seeing things as they are, the strength of no longer negotiating with reality, the strength of choosing not to return to what you now understand. And in that quiet internal shift, something powerful takes root. You begin to move differently, you begin to relate differently, you begin to choose differently, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because once you truly see the imbalance, you no longer feel compelled to participate in it. And that is the moment everything begins to change. When you stop trying to make sense of what drains you and start honoring what reveals. For a long time, loyalty feels like a virtue you must protect at all costs. You pride yourself on being the one who stays, the one who doesn't give up on people, the one who can be counted on no matter what. And there's something deeply insane about that. The desire to remain connected, to stand by others even when things are difficult. It comes from a genuine place, but somewhere along the way, that loyalty becomes entangled with something else. It stops being a choice, and it starts becoming an obligation. You begin to feel that walking away is betrayal, that saying no is selfish, that prioritizing yourself somehow makes you less caring, less compassionate, less worthy. And so, you stay longer than you should. You tolerate more than you're comfortable with. You silence your own needs just to maintain a connection that, if you're honest, isn't truly honoring you. And this is where something begins to shift, not all at once, but gradually. As awareness deepens, you start to notice the cost of this kind of loyalty. Not in theory, but in your body, in your emotions, in the quiet exhaustion you carry. You begin to see that what you once called commitment has slowly turned into self-sacrifice. And there's a moment, often a quiet internal one, where you begin to question it. You ask yourself, at what point does loyalty to others become disloyalty to myself? That question is not easy to sit with because it challenges something you've built your identity around. But it also opens the door to a different way of relating. Not just to others, but to yourself. You begin to understand that boundaries are not walls. They are not punishments. They are not a rejection of others. They are a recognition of your own limits, your own needs, your own humanity. And perhaps for the first time, you start to give yourself permission to have those limits. You begin to say no, not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly. You begin to step back when something doesn't feel right. You begin to recognize that you don't have to explain every decision, justify every feeling, or defend every boundary you set. And this can feel uncomfortable at first, because when you've spent so much of your life being available, being accommodating, being the one who understands, shifting into a space where you hold your ground can feel unfamiliar. There may be guilt, there may be resistance from others who were used to your constant presence. But something deeper is happening beneath that discomfort. You are learning to respect yourself. You are learning that your needs matter. Not more than others, but equally. You are learning that love does not require you to abandon yourself. That connection does not have to come at the expense of your well-being. And slowly your relationships begin to change. Not necessarily because others change, but because you do. You stop overextending. You stop giving beyond your capacity. You stop chasing balance in places where it doesn't exist. And in doing so, you begin to see more clearly who can meet you where you are and who cannot. And here is where the real transformation takes place. You no longer measure loyalty by how much you can endure. You begin to measure it by how aligned you are with yourself. You understand that staying in something that consistently diminishes you is not loyalty. It's self-neglect. And walking away from that is not abandonment. It's self-respect. So your boundaries become quieter, but stronger. You don't need to announce them. You don't need to argue for them. You simply live them. You embody them. And those who are willing to meet you in that space will remain. And those who are not will naturally fall away. And for the first time, that loss doesn't feel like failure. It feels like clarity, because you've come to understand something essential, something that changes the way you move through the world. Loyalty without boundaries will cost you yourself, but boundaries will teach you who is truly worthy of your loyalty. There's a misconception that when people leave, they do so in a moment of anger, in a burst of emotion, in some dramatic breaking point that everyone can point to and say, "That's when it ended." But that's rarely how it happens for someone who feels deeply. The truth is much quieter than that. By the time an empath walks away, they've already been leaving for a long time. It doesn't start with distance. It starts with endurance. You try to hold things together, to repair what feels strained, to give the benefit of the doubt again and again. You have conversations in your head that you never say out loud. You replay moments, searching for understanding, for clarity, for some way to make sense of what doesn't feel right. And through all of that, you stay present on the outside. You still show up. You still respond. You still care, but internally something is wearing down. It's the accumulation of small moments, the ones that don't seem significant on their own, but together begin to form a pattern you can no longer ignore. It's the times you felt unseen, unheard, or unimportant. It's the emotional labor that went unnoticed, the effort that was never reciprocated, the subtle ways in which you kept putting yourself second. And at a certain point, your system reaches its limit, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet realization. I can't keep doing this. This is what emotional burnout looks like. It's not explosive, it's not loud. It's a kind of internal exhaustion that words can barely capture. You find yourself pulling back, not out of strategy, but out of necessity. You stop engaging in the same way, not to punish, but because you no longer have the energy to continue as you once did. And often, this shift goes unnoticed by others at first, because you're not making a scene. You're not issuing ultimatums, you're simply less available, less responsive, less invested in trying to fix what has resisted change for so long. And here's the part that can be difficult for others to understand. By the time this withdrawal becomes visible, the decision has already been made internally. You've already processed the disappointment. You've already felt the grief. You've already gone through the cycle of hoping, trying, forgiving, and hoping again. And when none of it leads to a different outcome, something within you settles, not in bitterness, but in clarity. You realize that continuing to engage in the same dynamic will only deepen the exhaustion, that no amount of effort on your part can create balance where there is none. And so, you begin to let go. Not all at once, but steadily, quietly. You stop initiating, you stop over-explaining. You stop carrying the emotional weight of the relationship. And in that space, something shifts. It's not that you stop caring. It's that your care is no longer expressed through self-sacrifice. You begin to understand that constantly pushing yourself beyond your limits is not a sign of strength. It's a sign that something is out of alignment, and so, you choose differently. You choose rest over resistance. You choose distance over depletion. You choose silence over the need to be understood. And from the outside, this can be confusing. People may wonder why you didn't say more, why you didn't fight harder, why you didn't explain what was happening, but what they don't see is that you already did. All of it, just not in ways they recognized or responded to, because for someone who feels deeply, the loudest decisions are often made in silence. And when that silence arrives, it is not empty. It is full of everything you've come to understand, everything you've endured, everything you are no longer willing to carry. It is not withdrawal for the sake of avoidance. It is withdrawal for the sake of survival. And once you reach that point, there is no need for drama, no need for closure that must come from someone else. There is only a quiet, steady movement away from what has exhausted you, because at some point, you recognize this truth with undeniable clarity. When your soul grows tired of explaining what your heart has already outgrown, silence becomes your most honest answer. There comes a moment in this journey where something subtle, yet deeply transformative, takes place. It's not loud, it's not something you announce, but it changes how you relate to everyone around you. It's the moment you begin to understand that your presence, your energy, your emotional openness are not things that should be given freely to just anyone. For most of your life, you may have believed the opposite. You believed that being kind meant being available, that being loving meant being accessible, that if someone needed you, you showed up, no questions asked, no conditions, no hesitation. And in many ways, that openness is beautiful. It's what makes you who you are. But over time, you begin to see something you couldn't see before. You begin to notice how easily that openness is taken for granted. How some people don't experience your presence as something valuable, but as something guaranteed. Something they can step into and out of without awareness, without responsibility, without care. And that realization can feel uncomfortable, because it forces you to confront a painful truth. Not everyone who has access to you actually values you. At first, there may be resistance to that idea. You might try to explain it away, soften it, find reasons to justify their behavior. But as your awareness deepens, as you begin to honor your own experience more honestly, It becomes harder to ignore. You start to recognize the difference between people who genuinely see you and those who simply use your availability. You notice who respects your time, your energy, your emotional space, and who assumes it will always be there, no matter how they show up. And once you see that difference, something within you begins to recalibrate. You no longer feel the same urgency to respond to every call, to fix every problem, to be everything for everyone. Not because you've become indifferent, but because you've begun to understand something essential. Your energy is not unlimited. Your presence is not something to be consumed without awareness. And your emotional openness is not a resource for others to access without reciprocity. So you begin to shift. Not in a way that is harsh or defensive, but in a way that is grounded. You become more intentional with where you place your attention, your care, your time. You start to ask yourself quiet questions. Is this connection mutual? Is this person capable of meeting me in the same space I've been holding for them? Do I feel respected here or simply relied upon? And the answers to those questions begin to guide you. You don't need to make grand declarations. You don't need to cut people off in anger. Instead, you simply adjust your availability. You step back where there is no reciprocity. You become less accessible to those who have shown you, consistently, that they do not handle your presence with care. And for the first time, you begin to release the guilt that once accompanied these choices, because you start to understand that protecting your energy is not selfish. It is necessary. That choosing yourself does not diminish your compassion. It refines it. That not everyone is meant to have the same level of access to you. And that's not rejection, it's discernment. And yes, this may change how others perceive you. Some may feel confused. Some may feel entitled to the version of you that was always available, always accommodating. But that version of you came at a cost you are no longer willing to pay, because now you see your value more clearly, not in a way that elevates you above others, but in a way that includes you in the equation. You are no longer the one who is absent from your own life while being present in everyone else's. You are here now, fully. And from that place, your relationships begin to take on a different quality. They become more balanced, more honest, more respectful. And those who cannot meet you there will gradually fall away, not because you push them out, but because the space you now hold no longer accommodates imbalance. And that is not loss, that is alignment. Because when you truly understand your worth, you stop asking for space in other people's lives and start deciding who deserves space in yours. There is a quiet finality to the way an empath lets go. It doesn't come with a dramatic goodbye, it doesn't need a last word, and it rarely seeks recognition. By the time that moment arrives, something deep within has already settled. The questions have been asked, the efforts have been made, the patience has been stretched beyond what most people ever see. And what remains is not anger, but clarity, because leaving for you was never the first instinct. Staying was. You stayed through confusion, through inconsistency, through the subtle ways your needs were overlooked. You stayed because you understood, because you hoped, because you believed that with enough care, something might shift. And for a long time, that belief kept you there. But eventually, reality becomes louder than hope, not in a harsh way, but in a steady, undeniable way. You begin to see that the pattern is not changing, that the same dynamics repeat themselves, regardless of how much you adjust, how much you give, how much you try to meet the other person where they are. And at some point, something inside you no longer wants to negotiate with that truth. This is where detachment begins, not as a reaction, but as a decision. You start to withdraw your emotional investment, not all at once, but gradually. You become more observant, less reactive. You stop trying to fix what has shown no willingness to transform. And in doing so, you begin to reclaim something that was quietly slipping away. Your sense of self, because the truth is, every time you remained in something that diminished you, a part of you had to go silent to sustain it. A part of you had to adapt, to tolerate, to accept less than what you knew, deep down you deserved. And now that part of you is no longer willing to stay quiet, so the detachment deepens. You find yourself less emotionally affected by what once consumed you. The urgency fades. The need for resolution, for closure, for acknowledgement, it begins to dissolve. Not because those things never mattered, but because you've come to understand that not all closure comes from the outside. Some of it comes from within, from accepting what is, rather than holding on to what could have been. And this is where the real shift takes place. You stop looking back, not because the past has no meaning, but because it no longer has a hold on you. You no longer feel pulled toward what you've already outgrown. The familiarity that once kept you attached now feels distant, almost unrecognizable. And perhaps most importantly, you no longer feel the need to return, because you understand something now that you didn't before. Going back would require you to abandon the very awareness that set you free. It would require you to ignore the lessons, to silence your intuition, to shrink yourself into a version that can fit into a space you've already evolved beyond. And that is no longer an option, so your absence becomes steady, not reactive, not temporary, but rooted. You don't check in to see if things have changed. You don't reopen doors that closed for a reason. You don't revisit conversations that have already shown you everything you needed to know. And from the outside, this can be difficult for others to understand. They may expect you to return, to soften, to reconsider. They may interpret your silence as distance, your absence as indifference. But what they don't see is the depth of what it took for you to arrive here. This is not indifference, this is resolution. This is the result of choosing yourself, fully, without apology. And there is a kind of peace in that, a grounded, unwavering peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's behavior, validation, or understanding. Because once you have seen the cost of staying where you no longer belong, you no longer confuse familiarity with safety. You no longer mistake history for alignment, and you no longer return to places that required you to lose yourself in order to stay. Because at some point, the decision becomes clear, simple, and unshakable. When you finally choose your peace, you don't go back to what once took it away.